Right now, you are inside a country. You are also inside a building, a city, a legal jurisdiction, and an economic system. But the country is the only one of those that has no physical edge you can touch. If you walked toward the nearest international border, you would eventually see a sign, a booth, maybe a tired official, and a line on a map. But the ground underneath that line is just ground. There is no geological layer marked Belgium or Brazil or Nigeria. The border is not in the soil. It is an agreement that enough people behave as if it exists. And that is the slightly unnerving part. If enough people changed their minds, the border would move. If enough people stopped agreeing entirely, the country itself would stop being real. So, how did a species that spent most of its history in small, wandering bands invent something like that? That is the story. Most of us inherit countries the way we inherit languages or birthdays. They feel inevitable. But countries are remarkably new. Anatomically modern humans have existed for at least a couple 100,000 years. For the overwhelming majority of that time, nobody had a country. People lived in bands of maybe 20 to 50, with wider networks of a few hundred or a few thousand. They had family, clan, territory, season, language, gods, but they did not have a state. They did not have standing armies, permanent borders, passports, taxes, or national flags. A country is not the default human condition. It is a piece of social technology. To understand how that technology was built, you have to start with what humans already had: a weird social brain. Humans are unusually cooperative. A chimpanzee can form an alliance, but large-scale cooperation among unrelated strangers is not the norm for other primates. Humans, however, can sit in a room with strangers, exchange money, obey rules, and even line up. We have instincts for tracking reputations, debts, alliances, and gossip. But those instincts evolved in small groups. Anthropologists and psychologists working with hunter-gatherer communities have long noticed that human social life works best at a certain scale, somewhere around a few dozen to 150 meaningful relationships. Beyond that, you cannot know everyone. You cannot remember who owes whom. You cannot rely on gossip alone. You need a different system. This does not mean early humans were simple. They had complex rituals, art, kinship systems, and long-distance trade. But their political unit was based on face-to-face trust. If a hunter returned with meat and refused to share, everyone knew. Reputation was the police force. The idea of a distant government would have seemed absurd because there was no way to enforce it, no way to trust it, and no problem it needed to solve. For tens of thousands of years, the small band system was enough. If there was a fight, it involved people you knew. If resources ran low, the group split or moved. Territory was not owned like a deed. It was used, defended, sometimes shared, and usually bounded by rough geography. A river, a valley, a mountain pass. There was no exact frontier because nobody needed one. An exact frontier is a solution to a problem that had not been invented yet. The problem began to appear roughly 12,000 years ago, when people in a few parts of the world started doing something surprisingly unnatural. They stopped moving and grew food. Farming sounds peaceful in retrospect, but it was less a wholesome choice than a slow commitment. A patch of wild grain could be cleared, tended, and harvested. But fields are fixed. They need work every year. They produce a lot at once and almost nothing at other times. So people built granaries and stored the surplus. And a granary full of grain is unlike a dead antelope. It is too heavy to carry, too valuable to leave unguarded, and far too easy to count. Stored surplus changed the shape of human life. It meant that not everyone had to be a farmer. Some people could become potters, smiths, soldiers, priests, or rulers. It also meant that a permanent elite could live off the labor of others. More importantly, surplus produced a coordination problem. In a village of 500 or a town of 5,000, you could no longer settle every dispute by finding a grandmother who knew both families. You needed rules, authority, and a way to keep records. You needed something that looked like government. Early farming settlements were not automatically countries. They were dense villages with new social tensions. Some grew into large towns. There is a famous settlement called Çatalhöyük in what is now Turkey, where thousands of people lived in tightly packed houses. But it may not have had a central state. Scale alone does not create a country, but scale creates pressure. The more strangers you live beside, the more you need a system that works without personal love, fear, or memory. The first states appeared in several places: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, and later the Americas, about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. They were not countries in the modern sense. They were more like permanent power machines, built around temples, palaces, granaries, and military force. The early ruler was often part priest, part war leader, part administrator. The ruler claimed that the gods wanted the canals dug, the grain stored, and the city defended. That is not just propaganda. It was a way of making obedience feel less like a human demand and more like the order of the universe. If you defied the king, you were not just being disloyal, you were threatening the rain and the harvest. The city of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia may have had tens of thousands of residents. That is far beyond the number of people one person can know. The ruler could not rely on personal relationships. He needed symbols and institutions. The ziggurat, the temple, the wall, the army were all forms of communication. A massive building was not just a building. It was a statement that someone could organize your labor. The ruler became a main character in a story that thousands of strangers could share, even if they never met him. Here is one of the most beautifully unglamorous discoveries in history. The earliest known writing from Mesopotamia was not created for epic poetry or philosophy. It was created for accounting. The first cuneiform tablets from the city of Uruk around 5,500 years ago are mostly records of barley, sheep, beer, and workers. Writing seems to have emerged, in large part, because a growing state needed to remember who owed what. Before writing, a ruler's power was limited by human memory and rumor. After writing, a ruler could count things that were not physically present. The state could say, according to the tablet, this village owes 40 baskets of barley, and the villager could not simply argue with a memory. The earliest form of state memory was basically a receipt. Writing also gave rulers a new kind of permanence. A king could die, but the tablet remained. Debt, law, and property became stable outside any single person's head. This matters because a country is supposed to outlive its ruler. The institution becomes more real than the individual. The receipt becomes the foundation of the state. Once you can count people and goods, you can tax them. Once you can tax them, you can pay soldiers and officials. Once you can pay soldiers and officials, you can hold a territory larger than a day's walk. Counting and writing did not just record power, they created a new scale of power. But there was still one thing early states almost never had: a crisp border. For most of history, the edge of a kingdom was not a line. It was a gradient. The king's power was strongest near his palace, and faded as you traveled farther away. Between one kingdom and another, there were forests, mountains, shrinking villages, and local chiefs who might pay tribute to both sides, neither, or whoever had the nearest army that week. A map of the ancient world with hard borders is misleading. Real political space looked more like overlapping circles of influence. The idea that two governments should meet exactly at a clean boundary is a much later and much more peculiar invention. Empires made this even clearer. The Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Mongol Empire were not countries. They were multi-ethnic power systems held together by armies, administrators, and tribute. People inside them did not need to be the same. They needed to obey. A border was often a defensive line or a zone of control, not the edge of an identity. Even during the age of empires and medieval kingdoms, most people did not experience themselves as members of a nation. A farmer in what we now call France might have thought of himself as belonging to a village, a parish, a lord's estate, a language group, and maybe a distant king. But if you had asked him about his country, the question might not have made the same sense it makes today. The king did not need him to feel French. The king needed him to pay rent, stay peaceful, and not shelter bandits. Identity was local and practical. The nation-state had not yet been imagined. The giant leap came from a technology that seems, at first, totally unrelated to politics: printing. In the 15th century, the printing press made books and newspapers reproducible at a scale that had been impossible. Over the next few centuries, literacy spread. More importantly, people who were never going to meet began to read the same news, the same stories, the same laws, and eventually the same novels. A person in a port city and a person in a mountain village could share a daily rhythm of information. They could begin to feel that they belonged to one large public. The scholar Benedict Anderson called this an imagined community. That does not mean it is fake. It means it is a community of people who will never know one another personally, but who imagine themselves as one. This was a new kind of social glue. Before print, a king could control land. After print, a public could imagine itself as a people. Standardized languages became important. Schools taught a single official language instead of the local dialect. Newspapers created a shared version of the day's events. Old local identities did not vanish, but a larger us became possible. And once that larger us existed, politics could be organized around it. Governments quickly realized that print could create official language and shared history. They printed national dictionaries, textbooks, and newspapers. They built museums with carefully arranged versions of the past. They invented national holidays. Some traditions felt ancient, but were actually designed in the 19th century, complete with invented costumes and ceremonies. A country is not only made of land, it is made of a carefully curated past. That idea, that a people with a shared culture, language, or history should have its own state, is nationalism. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it became the most powerful political force in the world. It was not just a feeling, it was a demand. If there is a nation, there ought to be a country. Rulers used nationalism to strengthen their grip. One people, they said, so obey our laws, fight our wars, and pay our taxes. But people also used nationalism against rulers. If the emperor was foreign, or the government ignored your language, nationalism gave you a reason to rebel and draw a new border. The modern map of the world is largely a map of that struggle. Italy and Germany, which look like old countries on the map, did not exist as unified states until the 19th century. Before that, they were collections of kingdoms, city-states, and principalities. Once they unified, schools and armies worked hard to make Italians and Germans feel like Italians and Germans. The state did not simply express a pre-existing nation, it helped manufacture one. Meanwhile, the legal machinery of countries was being built in Europe. In the 17th century, after decades of devastating religious wars, a set of treaties known as the Peace of Westphalia created a template for a new kind of political order. The story is more complicated than the shorthand version, but the idea was simple. Each ruler would be sovereign over a defined territory, and outside powers should not interfere. That became the framework for the modern international system, a system made of formally equal states with recognized borders. A country was no longer just a king's personal property. It was a legal unit that other countries had to recognize. Recognition is one of the least visible but most important ingredients of a modern country. A country that no other country recognizes still exists on paper, but it has a much harder time borrowing money, making treaties, or defending itself. Sovereignty is a strange idea. It means that inside your border, your government has the final say. In reality, power is always negotiated. But the legal fiction of sovereignty gives countries their shape. It is a bit like a sports rule. It only exists because enough people agree to play the game. Once borders became legal, they had to be precisely drawn. That meant maps, surveyors, and negotiations. And here is where the lines became real in a new way. A border drawn on paper could be sent to a palace thousands of miles away and imposed on real landscapes. European colonial powers did this most brutally in Africa and the Middle East, drawing lines through ethnic groups, across traditional trade routes, and around resources. Some borders were straight lines because they were drawn by people with rulers in a room, not by people who knew the land. Those paper lines became real when soldiers and bureaucrats arrived to enforce them. The map did not just describe the country. In many cases, the map created the country. This is still causing pain. A border that looks clean on a map can cut a family's farm in half, separate herders from water, or join groups that do not wish to be joined. The border is often older than the nation it is supposed to contain. A country is more than a legal line. It is also a psychological relationship. Human beings are startlingly easy to divide into groups. Social psychologists discovered this in experiments where they placed people into completely meaningless categories, sometimes by a coin flip, sometimes by asking them to estimate the number of dots on a screen. Even when the group identity was that small and artificial, people still favored their own group and discriminated against the other group. They did not need shared history, kinship, religion, or danger. A label was enough. Nationalism plugs into this mental socket. A country gives you a label, a flag, an anthem, a national story, and a set of rivals. Your brain, which evolved for small band loyalty, treats that enormous abstraction as if it were a tribe. That is also why countries use the language of family. A nation is called a motherland or fatherland. Citizens are told to think of one another as brothers and sisters. Founding leaders are called fathers. Soldiers sing together, drill together, and sometimes call their unit a brotherhood. This is not accidental. It is a way of convincing a very old social system to accept millions of strangers as kin. The country becomes an extended family of strangers, but a powerful one. You can feel grief when a stranger in your country dies in a disaster, pride when a team carries your flag, and anger when someone burns the symbol. None of those feelings are rational in the narrow sense. They are real, and they hold countries together. Everyday nationalism is quieter. The flag on a public building, the weather map shaped like the country, the news reports about our economy, the team at the international tournament. Political scientists sometimes call this banal nationalism. It is the constant, low-level reminder that you belong to a nation. Most of the time, you do not notice it, which is exactly why it works. Countries also made people legible. Modern states wanted to know exactly who was inside them. They gave people fixed surnames, birth certificates, official addresses, and identification numbers. Before that, a person might be identified by their parentage, their trade, or a local nickname. But a tax collector cannot collect taxes from Ahmed's son, the one by the river. The state needed a stable grid of names and locations. It needed to count citizens, draft soldiers, deliver school systems, and decide who was entitled to what. In doing so, it created the modern citizen. The country did not simply arise from a group of people who already felt like one nation. Often, the country built that feeling from the top down. Censuses are another invention. Counting people sounds neutral, but it changes how people are classified. The state asks you to fit into categories: language, religion, race, citizenship. Before that, those categories might have been blurry. The census does not just count identities, it also helps create them. The passport is a good example of how recent and artificial this system is. In the 19th century, ordinary people could often cross international borders without showing identity papers. There were checks in some places, but the universal system of passports, visas, and border guards hardened after the First World War. States had learned to control their populations for war and economic planning, and they did not want to give up that control. Today, most people on Earth carry a booklet that says which country has agreed to be responsible for them. If you lose that booklet, or if no country recognizes your claim, you can become stateless. You still exist. You still have a body, a name, a past. But the international system does not know where to place you. That is not a physical problem. It is a problem created entirely by shared belief. Recognition is also uneven. Some territories have a government, a population, and control over their borders, but they are not widely recognized as countries. They may issue passports that few countries accept. Their existence is not just a legal question, it is a social question among governments. That is why a country's reality can feel so solid to its citizens and so fragile abroad. And because this whole structure is made of agreements, it can change faster than it looks. The Soviet Union dissolved into 15 states in the space of a few months in 1991. Czechoslovakia split into two in 1993. South Sudan became independent in 2011. The same land, the same people. But one day it was one country, and the next it was two. Passports changed color. Flags went up. Anthems changed. The physical world barely shifted. What changed was the story. Enough people and enough governments agreed to treat a border as real. This does not mean countries are arbitrary in a shallow way. They are real because their consequences are real. The line on the map determines which laws apply, which currency you use, which army might defend you, and which courts can hold you. But the line itself is still made of agreement. So how did humans invent countries? The honest answer is that they built them layer by layer, and they are still building them. Agriculture created stored surplus. Surplus created the need for permanent rulers. Rulers used gods and force to hold territory. Writing gave them the ability to count and tax at scale. Maps and treaties gave them precise borders. Printing and nationalism gave millions of strangers a shared identity. Bureaucracy turned people into citizens. And recognition by other countries turned all of that into a unit on the world stage. None of this was planned by a single inventor. It was a slow, uneven, often violent process of scaling up the human sense of us. You live inside this process. When you fill out a form and select a nationality, when you use a passport to cross a line in the earth, when you feel a small flicker of pride or discomfort at a flag, you are not observing a natural law. You are participating in one of the most successful mass agreements in human history. The country exists because millions of people you will never meet behave as if it exists. That is not a weakness. It is the entire secret. A country is a story that has learned to count, tax, map, and defend itself. And the reason the story works is that on some very old level, your brain wants to belong to a group. The country just gave that desire a border. A border is not a line in the ground. It is a line in the mind that has learned to check passports.